Sam, welcome back to Islamabad. You've become quite a frequent visitor here in Pakistan, and always a pleasure to have you here. I know you've grown up in South Asia. Could you tell us a little bit about what that experience was like growing up in India, at school? It would be great to hear a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's lovely to be back here in the great city. So my family has been out in Delhi for years. I come from a kind of distantly Anglo-Indian family, and I spent pretty much my entire life since 2004 based in Delhi. And it was this kind of, it was that moment when Delhi was still felt quite small town at that time. There were kind of very few cars on the roads. There were kind of, driving to school, we passed through these sort of jungly areas that I don't know where they exist anymore. It's like China. There's been so much construction, and these cities are unrecognizable. We used to say there was that Gurgaon was a distant town off on the edge, and now it's basically a kind of satellite city that's grown into the same space. But it was wonderful, and it's very much where I call home. But I think that's why I've always found Pakistan so fascinating. When I first came to Lahore in 2016, I think it was, despite the fact that I had grown up, I'd grown up in Delhi in the wake of the Mumbai attacks when India-Pakistan relations were at their worst, and suddenly landing in Lahore for the first time and being unable to really distinguish the city from Delhi, and finding it more familiar than, say, even Jaipur or Lucknow. And exactly the same worlds in all sorts of ways, was a shock, and I've been coming back ever since.
And what would you, I'm always curious to know, growing up, what would you eat at home? Were you eating desi khana? What would everybody wear? How was that?
Yeah. No, I mean, definitely a mix. We had a bit of Italian food, a bit of Punjabi food mainly, basically, and a bit of Bengali food as well. But it's a complete mix, and it also, gradually you learn new recipes from friends as you're growing up.
And when you visited, while growing up there, hearing and learning about Pakistan before you visited to Lahore, what was in your mind in terms of expectation of what the experience may be like, what you might see, or the people?
I mean, it was always the kind of, the long lost twin in some sense. There was always this sense that it would be familiar. But I think it was, the 2000s was that moment when you had all that footage of the kind of war on terror on screens, and there was just a sense that it was kind of, it was similar but much more deeply unsafe. And then, surprise coming here and finding that it's very, very similar, and that it's very difficult to distinguish between the two. You could drop me in Islamabad and I couldn't tell you whether I was in Islamabad or Chandigarh. You can drop me in Lahore and I couldn't tell you if I was in Delhi or there. So each of these cities is so familiar, and I think socially as well as culinarily, as well as fashion senses, everything. That it's just something that I've just been more and more amazed by.
And growing up between India and England, and being between two different worlds as you were growing up, what sort of impact did that have for you in terms of identity, and how has that sort of impacted where you are now?
I'm sure you have the same thing with your kind of Somerset world and your Islamabad world and your Di Khan world. But I don't know, I'm ethnically a Scot. I've lived my entire life in Delhi. I definitely call myself a Dilliwala. I'm not necessarily a Londoner, but I'm also never lived in Scotland, which is the country that I'm technically from. I'm the classic diaspora kid. London more and more is becoming a home as well. And it's a complicated identity that I've wrestled with, but I think it's an easier one than the ones that millions of other people have to wrestle with. Where I think we were chatting before Jasa Alawalia's book, Both Not Half, about kind of you can fully be both identities, not half.
I remember when you first came to Pakistan, you were interested in sort of conservation and working with the Aga Khan. And as the journey sort of progressed, where did it sort of go from conservation to where you moved on from say, university times?
Sure. So I very much was expecting to go into architectural conservation. I worked briefly with the Turquoise Mountain out in Kabul, and then got a summer internship whilst at university with the Aga Khan Foundation, working on restoring Al Tit Fort and the Lahore picture wall in the Lahore fort. Both of which I was doing very little. I was kind of, the summer intern who was made to kind of write a bit of copy here and there and, more just get a sense of the working environment. But I loved it, and I thought that that was where I was going to go. But I think it was in university that things began to change. It was, in particular, this conversation that I was having with some friends, an Indian friend and Pakistani friends, Sparsh, Sadia, and Amina, and we were all having this strange conversation about the fact that sitting in Oxford, we could all sit in one room, whereas in the subcontinent we couldn't. And that for Amina, it was just a 2-hour drive from Islamabad to visit Sparsh's ancestral home, which he'd longed to see, but he'd never been able to go to. Likewise, Amina was from Hoshiarpur, which from Delhi is just a kind of 3-hour train drive, but was virtually impossible for her to visit. Partition saw the largest forced migration in human history, and yet most people have not been able to, reconnect with their ancestral lands. And so I think it was from that that we started Project Astan, this organization to try and reconnect families across the divide. And it was from that that I began to work more closely with Partition. But Partition was always there. Growing up in Delhi, it's impossible to avoid. Delhi's a city of Partition refugees. The entirety of West Delhi is still built on the grid of the old refugee rehabilitation areas. The whole of East Delhi, similarly. And yeah, it's a... half of the old population of Delhi is now living in Karachi, and the new population's mostly from Lahore, Jhang, Chakwal, etc. So it's always been there in the background, but I think it was through working with Project Astan that I began to travel around Pakistan, I think, in a new way. We were traveling to old settlements in search of the remnants of old Hindu communities who'd left. And of course, Pakistan is littered with incredible old mandirs, gurudwaras, these places of worship, these old abandoned havelis that are often filled with the most gorgeous frescoes anywhere else in the world would be World Heritage Sites, and yet are sitting there left to crumble. And the tragedy is, of course, that on the other side in India, you've got exactly the same thing. You go to East Punjab, and every village has some old dargah or some old masjid that's just, gradually crumbling away. And so I think it was through that that I began to see both of these countries in a different way, and it began to become completely impossible to disentangle them from one another in my head.
And with Project Astan, when you'd set out to connect people who, between this diaspora, could you tell us a little bit about an example of somebody, or one of the stories of how that happened, or what it actually was?
Sure. So I'll give the example of this man, Iqbaluddin. Iqbaluddin was one of the first people that we were working with. His family migrated from Ropur in East Punjab to Lahore, and then later to London. And when we first spoke to him about partition, I think that there was this very status narratives that we were hearing. This is what Gandhi did, this is what Jinnah did, this was the story of the rise of the Muslim League, and it was notably a story without him and his family in it. He was telling us about the kind of, cleansing of Muslims from East Punjab and how you could never really trust Hindus and Sikhs. And yet when we began to ask more personal questions about his life before partition, his childhood, his friends, he began to tell us stories about his childhood best friend, this Sikh man called Narendra Singh, who all he wanted to do was to meet his childhood friend, who they'd stayed in touch for 8 years after partition, but then around the 65 war, suddenly, they couldn't send letters to each other anymore. And so we went out, armed with the one picture sent in 1955 of Narendra Singh standing in front of the old village masjid. And no one knew where it was, but of course, eventually we found some dhaba. There was an old man there who was like, oh yes, that is, on the hill up there. And so off we went, managed to find Narendra Singh's family. Narendra Singh himself had passed away, but his family was still there. And Kuldeep Kaur was living in Mohalli, just on the outskirts of Chandigarh now, with Narendra Singh's kids, who we were able to reconnect with Iqbal. They were all crying, and Kuldeep said, oh, you've got to come to India. Iqbal was like, oh, come to London, we'll get you a ticket. And it was this very deeply emotional moment. And in that moment, I think all of these narratives about the kind of emergence of India and the emergence of Pakistan sort of dissipate in the wake of this very human story of old friends reconnecting. We had President Trump recently saying that India and Pakistan have been fighting over Kashmir for thousands of years. And of course, within living memory, there was no border at all. So yeah, I think that was extraordinary. And then being able to create a virtual reality experience where he could walk around his old village, meet old people from the village, find his old house, etc. It was a very moving experience.
I really liked that, and it really resonated with me, particularly with younger people, how you were using technology for connecting people from another generation who probably never would have ever imagined that. But I remember, being a fan of the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, who very kindly had sort of helped us with, digitizing photographs and identifying people that, we didn't know with family photographs at home. And I know you worked with them during this project as well. And then when we were initially talking, you were coming out and wanting to do some of these connections, I remember. And it was more about, having that sort of exploration and some of the folks that you were meeting. And then as time went on, you've done this wonderful book. And so where did the idea or the origin of that happen? Because you were doing Project Dastan, had an interest, even like you were saying in the heritage and on the architecture. When did this sort of start becoming a vision for the project of a book?
For sure. I think it was just before COVID, and we were trying to, we began to realize as time went on, as we, what began as a university project was gradually growing into a greater and greater archive. We realized that most of the stories that we had were from urban cities. They tended to be upper class, upper caste, from kind of basically the big capitals, Delhi, Islamabad, Lahore, Bombay, Kolkata, etc., Dhaka. And what was missing was basically the other stories. This was a subcontinental event. Every province across the region was affected. I think very often we focus in on Punjab, which of course saw the most violent displacement. But you just need to go to Karachi today to see the sheer number of different places from across the subcontinent that people arrived from. You go to Tamil Nadu today in South India, a place that no one associates, and there's a whole empty Muslim area where the kind of old Nawab of Arcot's retainers all left for Pakistan. So I think we were trying to expand the geographic region that we were looking at, and in particularly looking at Northeast India, which was majorly affected by the creation of Bangladesh in East Pakistan, cut off from Chittagong, which was one of the largest ports in the region. And it was whilst interviewing a man from Tripura, when I asked about how partition affected the region, he responded, "Which one?" Because there were three great moments of displacement in the region as far as he was concerned, which was 37 when they were cut off from Burma, 47 when they were cut off from East Pakistan, and 71 when East Pakistan became Bangladesh. And I think that conversation reframed how I saw a lot of things. And I began to question why the hell Burma never featured in any of our discussions on partition, despite the fact that, as I quickly discovered, the first statement of intent to create Pakistan by Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, who coins the term Pakistan, the justification he uses for its creation is, it makes no sense to me why, if Burma is to be separated from the Indian Federation, the Muslims of northwestern India must be forced into it. So the very statement of purpose for the creation of the Pakistani nation was in relation to Burma, and yet Burma has been excised from the narrative. And then, of course, as time went on and I was trying to understand the scale of the Raj, there was more and more documents about this kind of western fringe of the Raj, the fact that Aden, in what's now Yemen, was the westernmost city, and the fact that Dubai, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, etc., were all essentially princely states. If you open the Al-Qabnama, the list of princely states, Jaipur, Jodhpur, Bhavalpur, Kashmir, Hyderabad, Chitral, etc., alphabetically the first one is Abu Dhabi. And yet somehow we've partitioned these histories itself by focusing in on only one of these ruptures. And so it was that really got me thinking about it. And the story of the book, in a sense, is how between the 1920s and the 1970s, 5 partitions transform Britain's Indian empire into 12 nation states, not just India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And it's a much larger story than I think we tend to realize, and one which explains so many of the great conflicts that we see today, everything from the Rohingya genocide, conflicts in Kashmir, Balochistan, Northeast India, civil war in Yemen and Burma, and even Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. All of these have their roots in these 5 partitions. that in a sense connects all these different stories, these different geographies that we all know are somehow connected, but we don't really look at in enough of a critical way.
I think growing up in a generation in Pakistan where we were taught not to question sources, and the books that we read was, this is what history is, and you never question it. And so we grew up never questioning sources and what histories were, and not encouraged to look at maps of the world, from a time where, one could make sense of it. It was only later at university that one started having some exposure. So with this project, because it's such a contested area and so many of us see it in just a very narrow prism, when it comes to sources, because you're talking of such a wide area that you've described, how did you go about identifying sources and languages, and what was the spread of the area when we're talking of 5 partitions? Could you give us a sense of what's the geography of that?
Sure. So in the 1920s, 100 years ago today, the Indian Empire, the region which is granted the Indian passport, the single colony, which is regarded as an empire within an empire because there's princely states, etc. It includes Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. These are the 12 countries that emerged from it. All of them were issued Indian passports. They're all guarded by the Indian Army, governed by the Indian Political Service or Indian Civil Service, and are all tied together by the web that was the British Raj, all under the purview of the Viceroy of India, in a sense. And legally defined by the Interpretation Act of 1886 as Indians, basically. So the transformation of this is I guess, what I'm looking at in the book. Remind me the other question, sorry.
No, that's addressing the geography part, which is really interesting. 12 countries is not something any of us think of.
But the sources.
But the sources, because like I said, we don't question any of those, and there's some sources that we just take to be the gold standard.
Sure.
So when you were doing this project, what were the sources, and were there any authors or any material that sort of inspired that?
There's a huge array of different things. So my background, of course, through Project Dastan was oral histories. So there are interviews in 8 different languages between all these countries that I conducted with the help of several friends, and often in Hindi and Urdu I was able to do it myself, in order to try and kind of, capture voices and put people back in the story. Also national archives in 5 different countries. I went to the archives there. In Pakistan, I didn't manage to get into the national archives, but I managed to get into several private archives. So, for example, the Noon family, I was looking at all of their documents on Firuz Khan Noon, who's of course one of the Pakistani prime ministers, the last prime minister before Iskandar Mirza's coup, and the one who secures Gwadars joining to Pakistan. It was previously Omani territory. So it's a fascinating story, and they had all sorts of amazing documents there, including the kind of, the letter that Iskandar Mirza writes when he stages the coup. Says, "My dear Sir Feroz, I'm so sorry, but I must abrogate parliament, end democratic process and institute martial rule." And there they have the document, which I just found extraordinary. But I think that there's a range of different types of sources, I guess, that I was trying to bring in the book, because also trying to bring together Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Burmese, Yemeni perspectives and follow the what-ifs, the paths that we didn't go down, but which could have created a different set of events. And so, yeah, there's a wide range of different things that I've been looking at here.
Were there any things that struck you that was very different from the sort of stereotypical narratives that we're brought up with in all of these countries?
A huge amount. I think, for one, a lot of the private papers relating to Jinnah. I think that Jinnah, we're so keen in this country, but also in India, in Bangladesh, everywhere, in Britain too. He's such a lionized figure. Here, he's the creator of the nation. In India, he's the kind of divider in chief. That we don't want to look at him as a human being and look at the evolution of his ideas over time. The Jinnah of the 1910s is a completely different man from the Jinnah of the 1940s, to the point that, when he leaves the Congress in the 20s, he does so because he regards Gandhi as bringing religion into politics. And of course, he later founds the world's first Islamic republic, or, it becomes a republic after his time. But it's an extraordinary there's an extraordinary personal life to him and personal tragedies. What's recently revealed to be the suicide of his wife, that I think was only really discovered recently by Sheila Reddy in her brilliant book Mr. and Mrs. Jinnah. It's a brilliant look at the man who becomes Quaid-e-Azam, but before he ever uttered the word Pakistan. I think that the other most surprising stuff was actually to do with the 1950s. There is this whole forgotten moment when India and Pakistan, after the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, put their differences behind them, and you get an Indian Muslim helping to design Jinnah's tomb. You get joint India-Pakistan passports. You get people like Zulfikar Ali Bhutto keeping their Indian citizenship right until the mid-50s so that they can resolve their property disputes and get their stuff in order. And then, most surprising of all, I think, is the fact that the predecessors of the ISI and RAW, the kind of intelligence agencies, actually began intelligence sharing operations to try and stop the spread of communism in the 1950s. And that goes on for a decade, from basically 51 till about 61, particularly in Burma, where they were worried that there was this huge buildup of communists that were going to spread across both India and East Pakistan. And so you have this whole forgotten moment of cooperation that I think we could do more to remember and highlight.
And I mean, that's very interesting because, like you say, it's not something that one thinks about within this context. Do you, with the conflicts that we see in the world and in this region now, how much of this, from your research, could you sort of attribute to with these partitions and the way they took place, or even sort of empire? What sort of impact has that had, and is there any sort of, have you found that governments are sort of learning lessons from history?
I'm not sure about governments learning lessons from history. But yes, I mean, all of the tensions that we're seeing now, of course, have their origins in, I mean, partition, particularly 1947, remains one of the most important events in world history, let alone South Asian history. It's up there with the world wars, with the Holocaust, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the Vietnam War, as some of the most important events in world history of the 20th century. It remains the prism through which a quarter of the world perceives their past, their present, and their future. And the furies unleashed by partition have not stilled. Like the divide grows ever wider. We continue to see the religious animosities, the suppression of minority rights across the region, and all of these various regional conflicts. The entire Indo-Pak conflict, of course, but what I find tragic recently, I think in the early Indo-Pak wars, what was different was that all of the military generals knew each other. As late as 1971, I mean, throughout the first war over Kashmir, you had cigarette boxes being chucked over the front lines containing messages between different officers who wanted to check that their friends were still alive, even whilst they were ordered to shoot at one another. And as late as 1970s, I think it was General Nagra, who was interviewed by the Observer correspondent after the fall of Dhaka, after Niazi's surrender. And he was asked, have you seen Niazi? To which Nagra responds, yes, it's so strange to see him in this context because they'd been friends at university and fought together in World War II together. And so to see his former friend as his defeated opponent was such a surreal and upsetting experience for him. And I think, that kind of relationship, I think we're moving away from, where now most Indians and Pakistanis just can't meet unless they spend time abroad. It requires spending a lot of time in Dubai or in the UK or in Europe or in the US or in Australia for Indians and Pakistanis to meet, become friends. And when they do, I think that unlike any other major conflict zone in the world, they almost always become friends. They'll be sharing the same music, listening to the same songs, eating the same food, and very quickly will often start dating one another at universities. And that just isn't the case with Ukrainians and Russians or Israelis and Palestinians. Any other major conflict zone of the 21st century does not have this person-to-person kind of friendliness, despite the fact that, on a governmental level, there has never been a worse time than right now.
And have you found that after the colonial or empire, was there ever, with your research, a sort of continuity of that sort of mindset within the government structures in any of these countries, or did they all sort of take very different pathways?
I think that in the 1950s, until I think the 65 war, is the moment that governments across the region start brushing over their shared heritage, and you get the passing of Enemy Property Act laws, etc. I think before that there was, this strange decade and a half where the shared heritage of the subcontinent was to some degree celebrated, despite the animosity over Kashmir, despite all the rest of it. But I think that we're moving further and further away from an understanding of the commonalities, sadly.
And I mean, I've also found that we've always talked about this, that it's always interesting in when you're in different homes, whether it's in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, sometimes, as you said, there's stories that get woven and interconnected that one never expects. And we were having dinner here last night, and I remember you were very excited about one of these, such a connection involving a puppy from Germany, and involving Afghanistan, and involving India, and involving Pakistan. I mean, please tell us a little bit about that.
So this is one of the most surreal stories that partition stories that I've ever heard, that I doubted until last night. I know the story from my family friend Marthan Khosla, who had this extraordinary experience when he went to university in London, where he moves into a flat with this Pakistani friend. They become friends in university halls, start chatting about, realizing they've got those in common, and they become best friends. And a couple of years into being best friends, they're chatting about partition, the fact that their families basically made the opposite jump: Delhi, Lahore, Lahore, Delhi. And I think his friend was showing a picture, saying, we've actually got a picture of our pre-partition house. Marthan was showing this, and then the friend is like, wait, I live there now. And they had, Marthan's friend had moved into his ancestral home, and so later when Marthan got a Pakistani visa, he was able to visit. But the most surreal moment is when he heard the story of how his friend had got this house. Because the friend's family in the 1920s, I think, had been working for some kind of trade delegation for the Afghan government in Amanullah's time. At some point, Adolf Hitler had a litter of puppies, and one of them had been given as a gift, a diplomatic gift, to this Afghan trade delegation. And now the Afghan trade delegation didn't want this puppy, which was a kind of, one of these, massive, very furry dogs from kind of Bavaria or something, and didn't want this puppy, so got given to a sort of Muslim merchant from Delhi who was just doing business out in Kabul at the time. So anyway, this guy, who's Marthan's friend's granddad, brings Hitler's puppy back to Delhi, becomes a kind of local legend. It's in all the newspapers. I've seen it on the archives. That everyone is making jokes when World War II breaks out. The fact that this puppy that once belonged to Hitler is now living in Connaught Place in Delhi, and it became a kind of bit of a local celebrity. Anyway, this family later become partition refugees 7 years later, and are forced to leave Delhi and leave the puppy behind, sadly. Moved to Lahore, and the refugee rehabilitation guy says, wait a second, I know you. You're the guy who owns Hitler's dog. And they get this gorgeous house on Mile Road that belonged to Marthan's family because of the fact that they had once owned Hitler's puppy. I was convinced that this story was, excuse my language, complete bullshit, because I thought there is no way, this is too surreal a story. There's too many kind of completely random moments. But last night, at this party, we were chatting to this lady whose family had worked at a trade delegation for Amanullah Khan's family in Germany. And she'd relayed, without knowing that I knew this story, relayed some story about this puppy being gifted and then eventually being handed over to a Delhi merchant. And I was like, is this real? Like, this story is actually true. And so I think that this is one of the crazy things with so many sort of oral history stories, is that you get these crazy moments of serendipity that you do not see coming. And when I went into partition research, I did not expect this Hitler's dog story to come out. It doesn't feature in my book, actually, because I thought it was too surreal. But then last night, hearing this story and finding out that actually this is a true story, Hitler's dog did make its way to Delhi.
I mean, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, it just makes me think about, because in our part of the world, like transmission, like preserving stories and histories, oral histories, particularly in tribal societies and in sort of rural areas here. It's always been seen as more of a primary source than something that's been written and static. However, we've been taught that if it's not written, it's not as authentic. But like the journey that you've described and gone on, looking at oral histories and seeing how they sort of inform a very human aspect. I mean, for younger people today, my daughter's 14, has an interest in, history and is looking at, where does she go next? So in today's world with the way media is and, the GBTs and everything, what would be your advice to these young people about because everybody's not able to travel and be able to meet all these wonderful people, how would they go about sources or informing themselves about historical events?
I think that there is so much available online now. Of course, with AI, it's getting more and more difficult to know what to trust. But I think that, as you said, like oral history are sources that can be attacked and grappled with in the same way that you grapple with a memoir. You look for biases, you look at what people might be trying to kind of cover up or hide, or where the big silences are. But they are sources that can be grappled with in a historical context and can be. And I think there's been a major reworking of history in the subcontinent, particularly where so little is written down, of trying to preserve oral history. So you've got CAP, as we discussed, in Pakistan. We've also got the Partition Museum in Amritsar in Delhi. And then you've also got this amazing 1947 Partition Archive in Berkeley in California, which is collecting all of these memories of people who lived in diverse places across the subcontinent, and the journeys their families went through, not just focused on partition increasingly, but also their other migrations, the connectivities with places like Malaysia or South Africa or East Africa, places like the US. There's a whole host of different stories that can be collected, and I think that you can begin, if you're enthusiastic about history, begin at home, learn your family's history, find what stories your elders remember. Of course, one can corroborate that with other sources, and it's important to have a critical eye. But I mean, go to the monuments that are there in your local city. Speak to the people that you know. I think that history is all around us.
And that's very true. And going back to where in the beginning when you talked about both, not half, as you've had, both of us, you've had your journey, being a Scot growing up in Delhi, having that sort of culture and identity that makes you whole. And for myself, my great grandmother was English. I was born in Abu Dhabi. I had some family here, which is in what is now Pakistan, and there was also family that is in what was India, and one was always conflicted about things around identity. But the way you've described it now, when you're talking about the region being one, even Abu Dhabi, I think all of these become all within the region. So I think for so many of us who identify maybe with a nation state, which hasn't been there very long, I think books like yours and research like yours also allows us all to see ourselves as a whole. And so, just sort of, I know that you've got a book launch coming up, and we have to probably wrap up quite soon. But as a sort of final message to, I think, the viewers who are probably from all these different countries, what would be your message about, if people are looking at things like this going forward? What are some of your thoughts on, these shared histories?
I think there's so much more in common than that we all have than we give credit for usually. And I think that I've been surprised by how many people have come to my talks and said, oh, my family actually migrated from Burma and we hadn't read books that put that in the context of what was happening at the time. Or one just needs to go to Karachi and there's families called the Dilliwalas and the Rangoonwalas. And that's the easternmost and westernmost city of the Raj. And yet today we've partitioned those histories off from Pakistani history, despite the fact that under the British Empire, these places were intimately connected. I've been finding this the more that I look at, for example, reading about French Indochina when I was in Vietnam recently, fascinated by how, because of the French Empire, French Pondicherry and Mauritius and Madagascar were all intimately tied to, Vietnam because of the French connection. And I think that these imperial connections matter and are rooted in people's families. They are the legacies of empire, but we live with the legacies of empire, right? I think that the basic message is we have far more in common than we realize, and however much we try to paper over this shared heritage, it's not possible, because there is still so much more in common that we all have. So my book, Shattered Lands, The Five Partitions and the Making of Modern Asia, is this extraordinary story about how the Raj was far larger than what we remember, stretching from what's now Aden to Rangoon and containing within it a quarter of the world's population, the largest Hindu, Muslim, Sikh and Parsi populations on the planet. In the course of 5 decades, 5 partitions tear this world apart, creating so many of the conflicts that we see in the world today, everything from Kashmir, Balochistan, conflicts in northeast India, but also civil wars in Myanmar and Yemen, the rise of Dubai, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. All of these have their roots, to some degree, in the 5 partitions that tear this world apart. And yet, I think what's also fascinating is how close it came to being different. The fact that we had, the largest political party in Burma wanting to remain a part of the Indian Union. You had, in the 1920s, Arabs in Yemen imagining a future where Arab was an Indian ethnicity. And there are all sorts of kind of close what-ifs that could have changed everything. Of course, we know some of the what-ifs to do with, had the cabinet mission plan, which Jinnah accepted, gone ahead, then Pakistan might have ended up as a part of a federated India. The idea was that just as the UK is made up of by England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, so the subcontinent could be divided into 5 nations: West Pakistan, East Pakistan, North India, South India, and the Deccan. And these would all be recognized as separate nations, but as part of a greater structure. That doesn't become the reality, but there are so many paths that the closing doors happen before which anything was possible, and after which nothing will be the same again. The history is suddenly wired onto a specific path, and overnight, something becomes inevitable in a way that it wasn't before.
Sam, thank you for taking the time today. Wonderful to chat with you, and best of luck with the rest of your time in Pakistan.
Thanks so much.